On the afternoon of March 7, 1945, a German demolition officer stationed at the western end of the Ludendorff Railway Bridge over the Rhine River at Remagen watched in disbelief as the explosive charges his own engineers had placed under the structure failed to fully detonate, and then watched American combat engineers arriving within minutes behind advancing armor begin working under direct fire to secure and reinforce a bridge that German High Command had assumed would already be lying in the river by the time any American unit came close enough to see it. The bridge held. American infantry and armor crossed the Rhine that day at a point Germany had believed was secure, weeks ahead of when Allied planners themselves had expected to establish a crossing anywhere along that stretch of the river, and the specific reason the crossing succeeded, beyond the failed demolition itself, was the immediate and highly trained response of American Army engineers who understood exactly what needed to be done to keep a partially damaged, actively targeted structure standing long enough for an army to cross it. This is the story of the United States Army combat engineer in the Second World War, a soldier whose contribution to the war rarely appears in the popular telling of famous battles and dramatic infantry assaults, but whose work German officers repeatedly and explicitly identified in captured documents and post-war accounts as one of the specific American capabilities that most directly and repeatedly disrupted German defensive planning across every major campaign of the war in Europe. To understand why German officers came to hold such a specific and often grudging respect for American engineering units, it helps to understand what combat engineering actually meant in the context of a mechanized industrial war fought across an enormous range of terrain and obstacles. From the fortified beaches of Normandy to the flooded lowlands of Holland, to the mountain passes of Italy, and finally to the major rivers of Germany itself. Combat engineers were the soldiers responsible for solving the physical problems that stood between an army and its objective, clearing minefields under fire, building and repairing bridges often while under direct enemy observation, breaching fortified obstacles, demolishing structures that impeded an advance, and constructing the roads and facilities that allowed a modern mechanized army to actually move its enormous logistical tail forward at the pace its combat units required. This work was rarely glamorous in the way infantry assaults or tank battles were glamorous, but it was frequently every bit as dangerous, and it required a combination of technical skill and battlefield courage that German officers who operated their own capable engineering corps were well positioned to recognize and evaluate with real professional authority. The first major test of American combat engineering capability against determined German defense came on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944. And it remains one of the most extensively documented and studied engineering operations of the entire war. German defensive planning along the Atlantic Wall had specifically anticipated that any Allied landing would need to overcome an extensive system of beach obstacles, underwater mines, concrete emplacements, and layered defensive work specifically designed to disable landing craft and channel attacking infantry into pre-registered killing zones covered by machine guns and artillery. Clearing these obstacles under direct fire in the opening minutes of the largest amphibious assault in history fell specifically to specialized combat engineer teams who went ashore in the earliest waves, often alongside or even ahead of the infantry they were meant to be clearing a path for. Tasked with destroying beach obstacles using demolition charges while under fire from German positions that had been specifically sited to cover exactly this kind of work. The casualty rates among these specialized engineer demolition teams on the most heavily defended sectors of the Normandy beaches, particularly at Omaha Beach, were extraordinarily high, a fact well documented in official after-action reports and in the personal accounts of engineers who survived the landing. Teams that had trained for months on replica obstacle courses built specifically to mirror German beach defenses found themselves executing that training under conditions of chaos and casualties that no training environment could fully replicate, working to place and detonate demolition charges on obstacles, while men beside them were killed or wounded by the same machine gun and artillery fire that was decimating the infantry attempting to move up the beach. Despite these losses, engineer teams succeeded over the course of the day in clearing sufficient gaps in the beach obstacle systems to allow the follow-on waves of landing craft and vehicles to reach the shore, a success that senior Allied commanders reviewing the operation afterward identified as one of the specific technical achievements that had made the broader invasion viable, distinct from, but every bit as essential as the infantry assault itself. German coastal defense officers who survived the fighting at Normandy and were later captured or interrogated left behind a documented record of grudging professional assessment regarding this specific aspect of the American assault. A German engineer officer who had helped design and construct beach obstacle systems in the sector overrun during the Normandy landings, in an interrogation record later reviewed by Allied intelligence analysts, described watching through binoculars as American demolition teams methodically worked through obstacle systems his own unit had spent months constructing, continuing the work under fire that was inflicting visible and severe casualties on the teams involved. He described this as producing a specific and uncomfortable realization that obstacle systems his own professional training had led him to believe would require hours to clear under ideal conditions were instead being reduced to passable gaps within a fraction of that time, achieved through a combination of technical proficiency and a willingness to continue the work, despite casualties that he noted, with what the interrogation record describes as evident professional respect, exceeded what German engineering doctrine generally assumed any army could sustain while still completing a technically demanding task under fire. The engineering challenges facing American forces did not end once the beaches themselves had been secured. The advance across France and eventually into Germany required American forces to cross an enormous number of rivers, canals, and other water obstacles, many of them defended by German forces who understood correctly that a river crossing represented one of the most vulnerable moments in any offensive operation, a point at which attacking forces were necessarily concentrated, exposed, and dependent on engineering units to establish and maintain the actual physical means of crossing. German defensive doctrine throughout the campaign in France and into Germany placed heavy emphasis on destroying bridges ahead of any American advance, specifically to force American forces into costly and time-consuming improvised crossing operations, a strategy that reflected accurate German understanding of how much a successful defense depended on denying an attacking force reliable crossing infrastructure. American Army engineers responded to this systematic bridge destruction with a combination of standardized, rapidly deployable bridging equipment and a level of institutional proficiency in assembling that equipment under difficult and often dangerous conditions that German officers repeatedly identified as a specific and significant American operational advantage. The Bailey Bridge, a prefabricated steel truss bridge design that could be assembled by trained engineer teams using standardized modular components without heavy cranes or specialized construction equipment, became one of the signature engineering achievements of the entire Allied campaign in Europe, allowing American and British engineer units to construct functional bridges capable of carrying tanks and heavy vehicles across rivers and gaps in a matter of hours, rather than the days or weeks that conventional bridge construction would have required. German engineering officers who encountered American and British forces rapidly reconstructing crossings that German demolition teams had specifically destroyed to delay exactly this kind of advance, repeatedly noted in captured tactical assessments and post-war accounts that the speed of Allied bridge reconstruction consistently and significantly exceeded what German planning assumptions had accounted for when calculating how much delay a destroyed bridge would actually impose on an advancing force. A German Army Group logistics officer in a post-war account collected as part of a broader historical study of German operational planning during the campaign in France described the specific and repeated frustration this pattern created within German command structures. He said that German tactical planning throughout the retreat across France had relied heavily on the assumption that destroyed bridges would impose meaningful and predictable delays on the American advance, delays that German commanders factored directly into their own defensive planning and troop repositioning timelines. He said that in practice, American engineer units repeatedly reconstructed functional crossings in a fraction of the time German planning assumptions had allocated, a pattern that occurred often enough across multiple river crossings that German commanders eventually began treating the assumption itself as unreliable. Forced to plan defensive operations around a significantly compressed and less predictable timeline for how long any given demolished bridge would actually delay American forces. He noted, with the specific and somewhat rueful professional candor that characterizes several German post-war engineering assessments, that this consistent underestimation of American bridging capability represented a genuine and repeated failure of German operational planning throughout the campaign, one that senior commanders were forced to acknowledge and adjust for, as the pattern repeated across successive river lines from Normandy to the German border itself. The engineering challenges of the war extended well beyond bridges and beach obstacles into the broader and less dramatic but equally essential work of road construction, minefield clearance, and the general logistical infrastructure that allowed a mechanized army to actually sustain its advance. American forces operating in the difficult terrain of Italy and later in the flooded and heavily fortified terrain of the Netherlands during Operation Market Garden and the subsequent fighting in that region relied heavily on engineer units to construct and maintain roads through terrain that German defenders had often deliberately flooded or otherwise degraded specifically to slow an advancing force. Work that required engineers to operate heavy construction equipment, often under direct observation and fire from German positions specifically cited to interdict exactly this kind of infrastructure work. Minefield clearance represented another area of sustained and dangerous engineering work throughout every campaign of the war, a task that required engineers to work with extraordinary precision and nerve, often at night and under fire, to clear paths through defensive minefields that German forces had laid specifically to channel and disable advancing American armor and infantry. The story of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, with which this account began, deserves particular attention as perhaps the single most consequential piece of American combat engineering work of the entire European campaign, because it illustrates with unusual clarity how directly engineering capability could translate into major strategic advantage. German forces retreating across the Rhine in early March 1945 had orders to destroy every bridge across the river, specifically to deny American forces any opportunity to establish a foothold on the eastern bank before Germany could organize its final defensive lines, and the demolition of the Ludendorff Bridge had been prepared well in advance, with explosive charges placed and wired for detonation specifically to ensure the structure would be destroyed the moment American forces approached. The partial failure of that demolition, caused by a combination of technical problems with the German charges and the specific circumstances of the American approach, created an unexpected and narrow window of opportunity, and it was the immediate, well-trained response of American combat engineers, working under direct fire to assess the bridge's structural integrity, reinforce damaged sections, and clear away the unexploded German charges that still posed a threat, that allowed American forces to actually exploit that window rather than simply watching a damaged and unstable structure collapse before enough troops and armor could cross. German High Command's reaction to the loss of the Remagen Bridge, documented extensively in the records and testimony gathered in the aftermath, including the courts-martialed German commanders faced over the failed demolition, reflects just how significant German leadership itself considered this specific engineering failure, and the corresponding American engineering success to have been. The unexpected Rhine crossing at Remagen forced German defensive planning to adapt on an accelerated and chaotic timeline, diverting forces to contain the bridgehead that German commanders had specifically planned around the assumption would never exist. And historians studying the final months of the war in Europe have consistently identified the Remagen crossing as a meaningful acceleration of the collapse of organized German resistance west of the Rhine, an acceleration made possible not by any single infantry assault or armored breakthrough, but by the specific and highly trained technical work of American combat engineers who understood, in the narrow window of minutes and hours that mattered most, exactly how to keep a damaged bridge standing long enough for an army to walk across it. Taken together, these engagements, the beaches of Normandy, the successive river crossings across France, the flooded terrain of the Netherlands, and finally the bridge at Remagen, form a consistent pattern that German officers across multiple theaters and multiple years of the war repeatedly identified in their own operational assessments, a specific and significant American engineering capability that consistently exceeded German planning assumptions and repeatedly disrupted German defensive strategies that depended on the systematic destruction of infrastructure to slow the American advance. This capability rarely received the kind of public recognition that infantry assaults, armored breakthroughs, or air campaigns received in the popular history of the war, but the German officers who actually had to plan and fight against it left behind a clear and repeatedly documented professional assessment of its significance, an acknowledgement made in captured tactical documents, in post-war interviews, and in the institutional memory of an army that had built its entire defensive doctrine around the assumption that destroyed infrastructure would buy time, that the American combat engineer had, again and again across every major campaign of the war in Europe, found a way to take that time away. It is worth understanding why American engineering capability developed to this level in the years before the war, because unlike some of the more dramatic tactical innovations that emerged directly from combat experience, this particular advantage was built primarily on institutional decisions made well before the United States entered the fighting. American military planners in the interwar years had placed significant emphasis on engineering education and standardized equipment development, decisions shaped partly by the country's own extensive civilian experience with large-scale infrastructure projects during the same period, An economy that had spent the 1930s building dams, highways, and major public works at a scale that gave American military planners access to a much larger pool of men with genuine civilian engineering and heavy equipment experience than many other combatant nations could draw on when building out their own military engineering corps. This meant that American combat engineer units frequently included soldiers who had operated bulldozers, worked construction sites, or built roads and bridges as civilians before the war. Men whose practical technical experience translated directly into battlefield engineering competence in a way that pure military training alone could not fully replicate. German engineering officers who studied, captured American equipment, and interrogated American engineer prisoners occasionally noted this specific difference, observing that American engineer units seemed to draw on a depth of practical civilian technical experience that gave their soldiers an intuitive comfort with heavy equipment and improvised construction problems that German engineer training, however rigorous, had more difficulty producing at the same scale simply because German civilian society had not generated the same breadth of large-scale mechanized construction experience among its draft-age population during the interwar years. The standardization of American engineering equipment represented another significant institutional advantage that German officers specifically identified in their assessments of American engineering capability. Rather than relying on custom or improvised solutions developed at the unit level, American engineering doctrine emphasized standardized mass-produced equipment, the Bailey Bridge components being the clearest example, but extending to standardized demolition procedures, standardized minefield clearance techniques, and standardized heavy equipment that could be operated and maintained by any trained engineer unit, regardless of which specific soldiers happened to be assigned to it at any given time. This standardization meant that American engineering capability was, in a meaningful sense, less dependent on the specific expertise of any individual unit or commander than German engineering capability often was. Since German engineering solutions frequently relied more heavily on the specific technical judgment and improvisation of individual officers and units working with less standardized equipment and procedures. A German engineering officer captured during the fighting in France, in an interrogation record reviewed by American intelligence analysts studying German engineering doctrine, specifically noted this difference, observing that American engineering units appeared able to execute complex bridging and construction tasks with a consistency and predictability that did not depend heavily on any single soldier's individual technical brilliance. A structural advantage he contrasted explicitly with German practice, which he described as often achieving excellent results through individual technical skill and improvisation, but with far less consistency and predictability across different units facing similar problems. This institutional and structural advantage compounded over the course of the war in ways that became increasingly significant as German forces retreated across successively longer supply lines and increasingly compromised infrastructure, and as American forces, by contrast, benefited from an engineering corps that grew more experienced and more effectively supplied with standardized equipment as the campaign progressed. By the final months of the war, the gap between German and American engineering capability had become, according to multiple German post-war assessments, one of the more clearly acknowledged and specifically identified American operational advantages of the entire conflict. A conclusion reached not through any single dramatic engagement, but through the accumulated weight of river crossing after river crossing, bridge reconstruction after bridge reconstruction, each one representing a moment where German defensive planning had assumed a delay that American engineers, trained, equipped, and organized specifically to deny that delay, had once again found a way to eliminate. What began in the documented record of German officers writing captured field reports in Normandy in the summer of 1944 as isolated and somewhat surprised observations about the speed of American beach obstacle clearance had become, by the spring of 1945 and the fall of the bridge at Remagen, a fully acknowledged and strategically significant pattern. One that German military leadership, in the final desperate months of the war, had been forced to recognize as a genuine and repeatedly decisive factor in how quickly and how completely their carefully planned defensive lines had collapsed.